think it's quite simple, actually, Dan, because if we don't measure the impact, then we're not going to get the reputation that L&D deserves. And I don't know of many departments who get a whole shed load of money without being able to justify what they've done with it and what they've done to improve what the organisation does. So I think it's quite straightforward. And I think L&D's got to a point where we need to do something real with data. We need to start doing it and justifying our existence, measuring the impact, and also to have some focus as well. It's about being curious to start off with. It's about getting nosy, and rather than thinking, oh, I've got all this data that I need to collect, what am I going to do, and you start madly collecting data, I think you need to start to get curious. And one of the things that I would start to do is to get close to the stakeholders, get close to the business, to find out what it is that actually are the biggest challenges for the business. And then what you need to do then, if a training request comes in or a learning request or something comes in that you need to do something about, just ask questions. Why do you need this? And a very simple example would be, somebody may come in and say, look, the customer centre needs some training done. And so rather than just saying, okay, is it just the usual that we do every year? You start to say, so what's been happening over the last year? Is there anything different? No, we just want the usual sort of stuff. And I wouldn't take that as being the final answer. So tell me more about what's happened this last year. Has anything changed? And somebody might throw away some little gem, some little nugget like, well, actually, I think we've had more returns on some of our products or whatever. You say, oh, well, what makes you think that? How much more? Is it hugely more? What sort of percentage are we looking at? So don't ever sort of like stop that curiosity. Just keep asking those questions until you can see something that you can think, well, actually, if we did some training around that or learning around that, or we did some help somewhere, it doesn't have to be learning or training, something was improved, that we'd be able to measure some sort of difference and some outcome. So you start with the curiosity, get nosy, and don't stop. There's a third thing that I would add into the mix, and that's your gut instinct. And quite often people think that when they start using data, everything has to be data driven. And now if you have all this data that's available, which it is, there's loads of data available out there now, companies are collecting it, think, well, what do I actually collect? So you can use your gut instinct or use somebody else's gut instinct to give you an idea of where to start looking. So if somebody said last month's sales figures are down, and you might say to like the head of the sales team, well, why do you think they're down? Got this hunch that it's such and such, I think actually we're getting quite a lot of returns on this product or whatever. So you might use somebody's gut instinct to then focus where you start looking. So you would start off with the quantitative stuff. So you start off with a gut instinct, so where do you start looking, so that you're not looking at everything. You might narrow down the search, so it might be the faults with the products, it might be follow-up with, phone calls, whatever. It might be a whole host of different things. So you start looking at numbers. And then the numbers in themselves will give you an indication of where the problem might be, but it may not identify what the actual problem is. And so the qualitative stuff, the opinions and all of that is then what you follow up with. So let's imagine you find that you've had a lot of returns of one particular product. And so you think, right, well, let's have a look at what the actual errors are or the faults are with them. Are they faulty? And you may find they're not faulty, they just don't fill the brief. So again, it's sort of the assumptions that you might make about it. When they say returns or whatever, it might be, you think, well, it must be faulty, but it may not be. It may just not be doing what it said it was going to do. The top one has to be about getting close to the business, because if you go off on a tangent doing wonderful stuff that means nothing to the business, you're not going to get resources, you're not going to get a good reputation, you'll be wasting your time, quite frankly. So you've got to get close to the business, speak to the stakeholders, find out what they really need, and find out what they need, what they're not necessarily say they want. Because somebody may say that they want something or need something, but when you start to get curious and find out what's underneath it, you may find actually there's something quite different happening. So you need to be able to get close, you need to be curious and find out what's happening. So that's the first one. The second one is about what I've just said about using your gut instinct. Don't just discard that, consider all the experience that you've got and think what's going wrong here, what could be going wrong, and focus in on those areas to start off with. Give that your focus just to begin with. And then the final one is about playing around with data. Now, I am a bit of a maths geek, I always have been. And so for me, it's not a difficult thing to sort of like spot patterns and play around with the data. I quite enjoy that. And I think people have got to start to enjoy that. And you can quite easily do that. You can start playing around. So you can put some data into a spreadsheet, start off with something small, use one type of graph like a bar chart or whatever, use a line graph, use a pie chart, and just ask yourself the question, what am I seeing in this one here? What am I seeing? What's the story that's coming out of the data? And I do talk about this in quite a lot of depth in my book, actually. I've written a book called How Not to Waste Your Money on Training. And there's a whole chapter dedicated to finding out what the story is in the data so that you can get more curious. And I think the more people do that, and I've done quite a few live sessions where people have started to look at a set of data and I've just asked them a question, what are you seeing here, from this table or this table? And they begin to see, actually, I don't necessarily even have to do any maths, And sometimes it's about pattern spotting as well. So I use the RAG system, red, amber, green, and so in a table you might colour certain boxes red, amber and green. And then you can start to spot a pattern. You'll notice a hot spot, you'll notice an area that's doing well as well, and then the amber area. So it's about being playful with the data and just being curious. The biggest challenge, I think, for a lot of people is that there is so much data around, and so they're swimming in data. There's LMSs that are collecting data, there's all sorts of analytics out there, and people are thinking, well, which bit do I actually focus in on? And one of the biggest mistakes people make is when something presents itself as a problem, taking it at face value. And this is where the curiosity comes in. This is where the questioning starts to come in as well. Because again, when you start questioning somebody, when you start to sort of dig deeper into what the actual issue is, you may find something quite different. I've had numerous occasions when I've been asked as a consultant to go into an organisation. They say, we want you to deliver this. And I started asking some questions, and what they wanted me to deliver doesn't actually quite fit in with what's actually going on underneath the bonnet. And so if you can ask those questions, you can find out, then it gives you a bigger insight. And you may find it's nothing to do with learning, nothing to do with any training. It may be just a process. It may be something that's gone wrong. It may be lack of resources. It may be bad relationships. It may be something else. So I think that goes in with one of the mistakes as well, is that assuming that it's actually going to have some sort of learning sticking plaster that you need to put onto it. And you've always got to have that ear out for other things that might be going wrong as well. I definitely do, yeah. I think, when we talk about demonstrating value, so what if by the end of it you haven't brought any value? What are people going to say? And I would go back to, well, what was the problem we identified in the first place? Was that the real problem? That's what I would sort of start saying. But there has to be a level of honesty. There has to be quite an openness, because if people are afraid for their jobs, their livelihoods, because they're not going to be able to demonstrate value, then you're not going to get people who are boldly going down that road as well. So I think something has to change in the L&D culture as well, in terms of, when we demonstrate value, what will happen if we haven't actually added any value? What do we do? What do we do? Because my gut instinct would be, well, what was the problem? Did the problem change? Because sometimes what happens is that people will identify a problem, and that is a snapshot of that particular moment. That's the other thing that people don't realise, is that data is collected on that day with that set of people, with those conditions, has something changed? So that would be the next question, is has something changed in the market? Because it may be absolutely no fault of yours, maybe something dramatic has happened in the market that you're not taking into consideration.